Good morning, everyone, and welcome for the last webinar of the year for our series on EU sustainable finance regulation. Over the past quarters, we got the opportunity to deep dive into key topics of the EU sustainable finance regulation, including MIFID II, RTS, PAI, and SFDR. And today, we'll close the year with a comprehensive overview of the key developments related to SFDR, taxonomy, as well as MIFID II. We will also spend some time on CSRD and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards with a presentation from ECOFACT legal experts, Lana, Ollier, and Núria, Fernández. The presentation will always, as always, will be followed by a Q&A. And this should hopefully obviously help you getting ready for 2023 and make sure you haven't missed anything over the past few months. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Lana and Núria for the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Aurelia. Yes, good morning from my side as well. As we are finishing this year, let's take a look at the last quarter, which certainly was very active. And in that, what we'll do is to take a specific look at the EU SFDR, which presumably kept you busy much throughout this year. The EU taxonomy, which to a certain extent, some of you will keep quite busy next year. The EU CSRD, where we had some significant developments toward the ends of this year. MIFID, which should be well progressing, also in terms of the self-regulation, of course, which builds on MIFID, also in Switzerland. We will then take a nice bow around all of this and see where we stand with the EU action plan and what to expect for 2023. So as we are starting a new year of sustainable finance, what should be on our agenda? We aim for like 15 minutes with a presentation, but again, there's a lot to cover, so we'll dive right into it and are then happy to take your questions. Because it's been quite busy, the EU was quite busy, as you can see here. This is only the final quarter here from September to December, and lots of developments as the EU is really trying to finish up here on concluding different work streams that they've been working on. And some things that essentially came out here weren't foreseeable in the beginning of 2022, but were more in response to really the market struggling in for example, disclosure. And also a lot of things that were originally promised for the end of 2022 didn't get delivered. This is due to delays, for example, on the side of the platform on sustainable finance that is advising the EU Commission on the taxonomy, where we have quite significant holdup in certain areas. Yes, what you see here is a lot of SFDR, a lot of taxonomy, some MIFID. So this is what we'll dive right into. And for that, I'll hand over to Núria, and you'll hear from me on the taxonomy later. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, also from my side. As Lana mentioned, we have had a few updates on the SFDR side that we were maybe not expecting at the beginning of the year, but as things have been evolving, we have all these beautiful updates here in the last quarter of the year. So to start with, in September, we saw that the ESAs questioned the EU Commission. If maybe we can move to the next slide. Yes, the ESAs questions the EU Commission on these certain known unknowns. So they sent 8 questions to the EU Commission regarding the definition of sustainable investment and also regarding the PIs mainly. These questions, they have not been answered. It would be nice if they would be answered before the end of the year so that we can all be ready for this big deadline of the 1st of January 2023. But so far, we don't have a timeline on when this will be published. Certain voices in the EU Commission, they say it will be after this big deadline of the 1st of January, so that the EU Commission has a bit of time to see on how the market has reacted to this RTS and to give a proper answer to this question. Yes, also the RTS, which entered into force in January 2023, they were published in April. They were then finally adopted in July, and they have already been amended. So the ESAs published the final joint report setting out the draft amendments to this level 2 RTS. The changes were due to the inclusion of gas and nuclear into the EU taxonomy. And there are some changes in the information that needs to be provided in the pre-contractual documents, in the website, in the periodic reports regarding this exposure to gas and nuclear energy activities. For example, in the pre-contractual documents, financial market participants will need to include pie charts disclosing the degree to which the investments are exposed to gas and nuclear activities. The aim is that these amendments will take effect from 1st of January 2023. As of now, the proposal has been sent to the Council and the Parliament, and they have 3 months to scrutinize this proposal. So far, we are expecting this to be approved by the end of the year, but nothing yet. The ESAs were also charged in November with coming up with possible amendments to the PAI regime and coming up with some solutions to the uncertainties that we have there. Nonetheless, this will not be delivered by the initial deadline, which was April 2023. The ESAs claim that they have been very busy developing the RTS related to gas and nuclear. So they need 6 more months, they estimate, to produce these amendments. So we will also be expecting this by the 3rd quarter of 2023. If we move forward, the ESAs published a Q&A, which they have been developing for the past few months and years now. This Q&A builds up on previous Q&As, and it deals mainly with PAI disclosures, financial product disclosures, and taxonomy aligned investment disclosures. It's applicable directly, so it's immediately applicable, and it's applicable, of course, to all the firms subject to the SFDR. To deep dive a little bit more into this Q&A, regarding the PAI disclosures, if we can move to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Regarding the PAI disclosures, they recommend that the data sources are disclosed as a good practice. So the idea is that the financial market participant includes the proportion of investment for which they have gathered the information directly from the investee companies, and that they include the proportion of information that they have gathered from relying on third-party data providers. This is, of course, not mandatory, but a recommendation. They also clarified that in respect to the delegation activities and PAI disclosures, the financial market participant who delegates management to another entity should still include these investments in their PAI reporting. And finally, on the PAI side, they clarify what all investment means, and this means that it should include all direct and indirect investments, but also, for example, investments through a fund of funds. Also in this Q&A, there are a few clarifications regarding the financial product disclosures. So, for example, in regards to the RTS, there's a possibility to remove certain sections. The ESA say that the sections that can be removed from the pre-contractual and periodic disclosure templates are those that are indicated in red text. Regarding the good governance, the ESAs provide flexible guidance as of the use of the metrics such as the UN Global Compact, the OECD guidelines, or the ILO principles on the ILO principles, and they prescribe them, but they could also other standards could also be used to assess the good governance. When it comes to Article 6 products, the ESAs reiterate that in the unlikely situation that these kind of products do not consider ESG risks, an explanation must be given. And when it comes to the concept of sustainable investment, or more precisely in the case of sustainable investment assessment, they confirm that financial market participants can create their own sustainable investment frameworks, and that this needs to be consistent. So it cannot be changed different for different financial products. And then if we move forward to the taxonomy aligned investment disclosures, the ESAs give guidance on calculating taxonomy aligned investment and PAI impacts. When it comes to Article 8 products that don't commit to make sustainable investments, financial market participants can leave out the disclosure of sustainable investment during the reference period from the periodic disclosure. For Article 9 products that do no significant harm needs to be applied to all sustainable investments, meaning that when an Article 9 product is partly taxonomy aligned, the DNSH requirements also need to be applied to the taxonomy aligned activities. And finally, the ESAs clarified that third-party review compliance of investments is not required for Article 3 of the taxonomy regulation. It's not required, meaning that it's optional. And if we move forward, the latest development when it comes to the SFDR is this consultation that has been done regarding the fund names. So the fund name is usually the first information that a potential investor or investor has regarding a fund, and while investors should maybe look into other things, the name can have an impact on the investment decisions. So ESMA is proposing to introduce quantitative thresholds for the minimum proportion of investments sufficient to support these sustainability related names. This is due, and we have seen these kind of initiatives in other markets such as Germany or France, also in the US or the UK FCA. This is now on a consultation stage, so we will have to wait and see what are the results. We would expect something for around Q3, Q4 next year. And as you see, there have been a lot of developments when it comes to the SFDR. Some of the developments, as Lana mentioned, were not expected at the beginning of the year, but they have been evolving throughout 2022. So it's important to keep up with the Q&As of the Commission, with the ESA's guidance, the clarification, the supervisory statements, to understand how regulators will assess what the financial market participants are doing, and see if some answers can be drawn from this guidance from the Commission and from the regulators. Also, we think it's important to look at the previous drafts of the RTS and the RTS templates, because the working documents give a lot of information on the reasoning behind certain things. So that can also help with the interpretation. And then certain industry associations have published guidance for its members, so for their specific needs on key points of the SFDR. So when possible, you may also want to check that information. And with this very quick SFDR update, I will hand it over to Lana, and she will update us on the EU taxonomy.
Perfect. Thank you, Núria. Yes, let's also take a look at the EU taxonomy. There's also been some developments, some further guidance being published, as I said, in particular by the PSF, Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is a multi-stakeholder platform that advises the Commission basically on the development of the taxonomy. So a lot of these initial recommendations come from them. However, what is also important to know, it's just guidance that they're providing to the Commission, okay? So the Commission is not bound by the recommendations and can basically use this as an input. And over time, we've actually seen that the Commission has diverted further from the PSF's recommendation. What's also important to know is that we're getting a new PSF now, so new members for the PSF, as the current PSF is reaching the end of its mandate. So the PSF was looking, or is still looking, for new members to join now, which is probably also a good development in that the PSF was quite unhappy with the acceptance of nuclear and gas, and have managed to put themselves with the Commission there a bit in the gridlock. So this will provide some fresh blood, and then hopefully some movement there. So this is basically the developments we're also seeing here. And at the end, I will briefly touch upon the CSRD also, and the standards adopted there, which is also an interesting insight about how the EU thinks about disclosures. Of course, the taxonomy has thus far been not particularly relevant to investors, predominantly because at the moment we're at the stage of corporate disclosure. So it was up to the corporates this year to report eligibility and then alignment next year. And then based on this in 2024, financial institutions are only required to report their taxonomy alignments under the taxonomy regulation. And in this context, of course, Annex 5 is particularly important and something that will presumably will then keep some of you busy in gathering this data next year. With that, let's take a look at the specific requirements here. So one of the most significant developments was actually that the EU Commission published the final version of its 33 frequently asked questions, FAQs, on the interpretation of Article 8 of the Delegated Act or Disclosure Delegated Act made under Article 8 of the EU's taxonomy regulation in the official journal of the EU in October 2022. So this has been long awaited. This is also what contains the specific KPIs basically that we need to use to report. The new FAQs supplement the 22 other questions and responses published already in December 2021 and the draft FAQs in February 2022. I think the most significant thing here that was really touched upon in this FAQs was the use of estimates, which will presumably also be relevant for financial institutions in particular, as they are moving into their disclosures. And here we need to be quite careful because quintessentially, in this FAQs, the Commission is diverting a little bit from previous guidance given by the ESMAs, in that they now give some flexibility around reporting based on estimates, as long as this is not basically an NFRD already reporting companies. They give some flexibility as to use this. And I assume that this, or one reason for this, is that at the moment, a lot of fund managers are reporting their taxonomy alignment as 0. And what the Commission is increasingly seeing is that there is a data gap that is already there quintessentially with the corporates reporting, and that they want to tackle this early on. And as we're moving further into next year, I assume that there is going to be some flexibility around the use of estimates, simply because the EU Commission, I think, was quite optimistic in the beginning in getting this data, and is now realizing itself a little bit that this might not necessarily be the case. So this is certainly something to follow into next year. Then we had a platform report. I talked about the platform a little bit earlier, and they published a report on data and usability. And specifically, I think this was tackling a lot, and generally the PSF PSF's reports are geared a little bit more towards corporates, as they're really struggling with disclosure at the moment, right? Since financial institutions are not really reporting at the moment, they are not struggling as much yet. So I think the guidance at the moment is a little bit more geared towards the corporate disclosure, and I would think that the next PSF is going to take financial institutions a bit more into focus there. So again, this was a report or recommendations on data availability and usability of the EU taxonomy. And here the PSF identified 5 broad categories, essentially, of usability issues, which will sound quite familiar for you that have been implementing the SFDR already, because there we were facing similar struggles. And this is misalignment between sustainability reporting requirements across the regulatory framework, sequencing issues across the reporting framework, so the order in which things arise, the regulatory overload, which we probably also all know all too well, and if we look at this last quarter, it becomes painfully obvious, the interpretive issues around what needs to be reported, how and by when, certainly something that we also know from the SFDR all too well, and regulatory and data gaps, which I assume is something that you are struggling with as well. Again, the report also clarified what essentially needs to be up to external verification and assurance. And for now, there is no need for external assurance. However, this will change with the CSRD becoming applicable then from 2025 onwards. So that will be then somewhat up to a change. We'll look at this later. Yes, so that was the first report, but there's many more to come. The second one was on minimum safeguards. And essentially, this is to make sure that companies are really also taking into consideration or not have any negative impacts on human rights, because the EU does not consider an activity to be taxonomy aligned if it hurts or harms any human rights, basically. And again, like in this report, one of the main aims was to embed this a little bit within the existing regulations. So really specifically making this links to SFDR, CSRD, and also the CSDD, which is something that presumably is going to move a big step forward next year. At the moment, it's still a little bit of a question mark in terms of how financial institutions are going to be dealt with under the CSDD. And also in this report, to be plainly honest, also the PSF didn't position itself quite that strongly with regards to the CSDD just yet, because they plainly don't know the final version of this yet. So this is also something to watch, as the two will probably be linked. Then the identification of substantive topics related to the standards and norms laid out in Article 18 of the taxonomy regulation, and then simply advice in complying with minimum safeguards. And this is also quite important, that they really defined more specifically those 4 core topics that we are looking at here, and sort of concrete criteria to meet those. So those 4 core topics are human rights, bribery and corruption, taxation, and fair competition, that really could not be harmed, and where we need to essentially meet very distinct criteria. So it does provide a little bit of guidance in how to make this more concrete, quintessentially, and how to disclose based on this. However, again, I just want to highlight that this is not the final quintessentially position that necessarily will be adopted by the EU Commission, as this is up to their scrutiny in the end, and this is just a recommendation. Then we have the ESMA common enforcement procedures. Again, this is also more geared towards, I would say, currently corporate disclosure, so non-financial disclosure. However, it might be interesting, just as it gives investors an idea of how they will be supervised, and also gives you an idea of how on the level of individual companies reporting at this point in time. So what they are really essentially making clear is their enforcement procedures and give essentially also recommendations for enhanced disclosures on taxonomy eligibility and alignment by non-financial undertakings, and they will now specifically review essentially the reporting prepared from 2022. So this will certainly also be something to keep an eye on as to get an understanding of how the enforcement of it all will look like when financial institutions and specifically investors will need to report as well. Then we also had a call for evidence on greenwashing. I think greenwashing will be really one of the core issues that will keep us quite busy in 2023. Also in Switzerland specifically, we are looking more closely at this now, and we really essentially need more guidance here. And this is also something that the EU will want to look at, and basically is seeking inputs on key features, drivers, and risks of greenwashing, as well as examples of malpractice. And based on this, the ESAs will then recommend potential regulatory actions in the next year. So this is still open for responses until January 10th, 2023, and again will then possibly lead to some further regulations into next year or even the year after. So certainly something to keep an eye on as we're moving into next year. Then last but not least, we have another PSF report, a lot of them being delivered here as this mandate comes to an end of the current platform again. And here, basically, this was on enabling activities, which is a different, let's say, animal in the stable, and something that thus far we have not heard that much about. And this is basically not directly aligned activities, but rather those are activities that allow other activities to make a substantial contribution. So for example, that would be a product that helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, already in the use phase. So they really have this enabling dimension. And again, there was a set of recommendations published to the PSF, from the PSF, on how to take this into consideration. And as we are seeing a sort of broadening of the taxonomy, this will certainly also be something to keep an eye on. Then the key steps for implementing this update, also to give you a sort of roundabout of what you should be looking at. And in 2023, we will have a new advisory body. The Sustainable Finance Platform will continue developing the EU taxonomy. And it's important, of course, that you stay up to date on its work and positions. Again, those are not directly, those are only recommendations to the Commission, so they cannot be taken as necessarily the final position. Nonetheless, important to keep an eye on this and their work schedule quintessentially. Then something that was originally supposed to happen at the end of this year, but it did unfortunately not happen. And this is quite surprising, as we were getting signals from the EU that they, and the PSF in particular, that they had already finalized this as the remaining environmental objectives. So at the moment, we only have, of course, technical screening criteria for climate, and not the remaining environmental objectives. So those unfortunately weren't published. So this will presumably something I would assume that we'll see then in the first quarter of 2023. I think it's also important that we as investors review carefully the FAQs published in October and really develop a data strategy based around this clarification. I know that there's still a lot of questions, but I would think that we could potentially move into somewhat of a use of estimates and really develop a strategy around this if you will report then from 2024 onwards, which of course also depends on your exposure to the EU directly. So that would be it from taxonomy side, so to say. And with that, I also want to take a quick look at, I think, one other very significant development, in particular for companies that have direct exposure to the EU, okay? And that is First of all, the adoption of the CSRD on November 11th. It was adopted by the EU Council, previously adopted by the Parliament, and therefore now will be published in the official journal of the European Union and then can be transposed by the member states. Because of course this is a directive, so member states will need to transpose this. It has a quite long phased-in implementation pipeline, starting the first reporting in 2025, with the requirements becoming applicable, then the transposed requirements becoming applicable in 2025. This is then more aligned also with Swiss reporting standards, for example. So based on the CSRD, which basically says, okay, you need to report on certain ESG issues, on certain sustainability issues, we have a standard according to which we should report. And this is the ESRS, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So while the CSRD only defines that you have to report, the ESRS now defines what you should report. Important distinction. And this is what we see here. So this initial proposal for the ESRS was proposed by the ECOFACT, which is basically the multi-stakeholder group now supporting the EU Commission in its development of this ESRS. So we have a lot of stakeholder groups here that are working together to support the Commission in a lot of different abbreviations. So in this case, it's the ECOFACT. And the ECOFACT now has delivered a final approved proposal to the Commission, which will now consider this and is looking to adopt a final standard in June, by June of next year. So this will now move rather quickly. So what you see here is essentially what the ESRS, so the ECOFACT, proposes as different reporting topics. So we have here cross-cutting standards, topical standards, and then SME standards. The cross-cutting standards need to be reported on mandatory. Also, we have to report on climate change and on our own workforce mandatory. And this is basically needs to be done by every company. For the remaining issues, so those are the ones that don't have this red question, this red outlining here, it is up to a materiality assessment to determine whether you need to report on these. Important, before we go into the materiality assessment, which I think is a core feature of it, Appendix 3 and 4, if you want to look at these documents, are quite interesting, as they really show how you can use different data already reported and under other EU regulation in preparing your reporting here. So if you have exposure to the EU, that could be quite interesting. And here then to the core of it all, and that is a materiality assessment. So quintessentially, you have to show which areas of ESG, of sustainability, are material to you and then report those. And even if you determine that they're not material, you have to include a specific phrase in your reporting that states that they are not material. So everything is up to a materiality assessment, and this is even broader than in the initial proposal here. And importantly, the EU takes here a double materiality approach. That means we look at financial materiality as well as impact materiality. So impact materiality being my impact as a company on the environment as a whole, as opposed to just the outside-in perspective where I basically only look at things that have a direct financial impact for my company. This is also specifically relevant as this is the approach that also Switzerland takes. And while the financial materiality approach is really something where we communicate predominantly to investors as companies, impact materiality goes way beyond this and basically talking to a broader audience here. So this is one of the important distinctions also with the US and existing reporting standards that is really being taken here. And in our materiality assessment, we also really need to take into consideration. And again, we need to always start with this materiality assessment as to determine what is material for us as a company. And even though This is not as specific in the Swiss ordinance on climate disclosures, but also in the counter proposal. This is theoretically the starting point, even if it's not put into so many words, and you don't have to do a materiality assessment to exclude specific issues. This is quite essential to keep in mind, and I think the EU gives a bit more guidance there. So certainly something worth to look at. With this, I will hand over to Núria, who will also quickly dive into MIFID 2 with us.
Yes, so MIFID 2 was already the topic of our June webinar. And there we were dealing mainly with the run-up to the 2nd of August deadline. In that webinar, we mentioned that there were some guidelines that were being consulted by ESMA regarding the suitability assessment and the sustainability preference linked to it. And in that webinar, we mentioned that we were pending the final guidelines from ESMA. So these guidelines have now been published, and they clarify a little bit more how this suitability assessment to assess the sustainability preferences of clients or potential clients need to be carried out. So in that sense, we have a bit more clarification on how to obtain these sustainability preferences. So before it was not clear whether a full suitability assessment had to be done after the entry into force of these amendments, or we could wait until the next regular update. So now in these guidelines, they have clarified that the suitability preferences, especially the sustainability preferences of the clients, can be obtained in the next regular update that needs to be done on a regular basis to the MIFID clients. They have also clarified some points regarding the PAIs. So guidance has been given on the question that firms must ask in order to gather information on PAI-linked sustainability preferences. So there are a few questions listed there that could be useful for the audience here today, and that could be useful if you need to update your sustainability preferences questionnaire in line with these final guidelines from ESMA. And finally, they have also clarified some points regarding the minimum proportions of sustainable investments. So previously, it was stated that ranges were permitted to assess the client's preferences for a minimum proportion of sustainable investments. And this has changed now. And the updated guidelines, they make references to ranges instead of sorry, now they make reference to minimum percentages instead of the ranges. So the questions that can be asked are more something like, do you want a minimum sustainable investment of 25% or 30% instead of between 20 and 30% as it was before. These final guidelines apply 6 months after their publication in the ESMA website, so that will be around March next year. So if there are some changes to be done in the previous sustainability preferences questionnaire that you developed, you still have until March next year. And then when it comes to the amendments related to product governance, that's the next slide. MIFID 2 also had amendments in the product governance processes related to sustainability. This is basically to assess whether a certain product with a sustainability profile fits a specific target market. So these amendments enter into force in November, the 22nd of November. As this was a delegated directive, it had to be transposed into the national legislation of the different EU countries. And some countries, unfortunately, they still have not transposed this directive. Nonetheless, they're still, even though they would have transposed, we still need some clarification from ESMA. So there was a consultation on draft product governance requirements guidelines. This consultation closed in October, and we expect the final guidelines as we expected, the ones related to the suitability questionnaire. We expect those for the first quarter of 2023. So that will also give a bit more guidance on how to approach the sustainability related amendments to the product governance procedures when it comes to MIFID. And in order to keep up with all these MIFID changes and amendments, we really recommend that you review the final guidelines from ESMA on sustainability related aspects of MIFID II. The final guidelines are basically or very similar to the consultation that was carried out, but there are some clarifications that might affect the way you communicate to your clients and the way you phrase certain things in your sustainability preferences questionnaire. So important to keep an eye on those and see if there are some changes to be made. And a second stage, also check the transposition of the MIFID delegated directive dealing with product governance requirements into national law and see if this might affect some of your products because they are domiciled in certain countries that they have made small amendments to this delegated directive. And finally, also keep an eye on the ESMA consultation or the result of the ESMA consultation on the draft product governance requirements guidelines that will come next year and will maybe affect the way you build your product governance around sustainability. Yes, so that's everything for MIFID. And if we have a quick look on where do we stand after 2022 or as of December 2022 for the EU action plan, we have here this beautiful image that keeps us busy. So the two cornerstones of the EU action plan are the SFDR and the EU taxonomy, which are very much linked to the CSRD, as Lana mentioned, but the EU decided to start the house the other way around. So the CSRD will enter into force after the SFDR and the taxonomy. So as of now, we have this picture. When it comes to the SFDR, it has already been in place since March 2021. The RTS have also been applying for a while now. And especially now with the deadline of the 1st of January, it's important to keep up with the developments there also when it comes to gas and nuclear. The taxonomy really informs the SFDR disclosures too. So for now, we have the Climate Delegated Act and the Article 8 Delegated Act, but we are still waiting the delegated acts for the 4 remaining objectives, which will also affect the disclosures under the SFDR and the RTS. And also linked to the SFDR and the EU action plan in general, we have had amendments to MIFID, as we just mentioned. So the sustainability preferences have been added to the suitability questionnaire or the suitability assessment, and also when it comes to product governance requirements linked to sustainability. And we also have had amendments to the UCITS directive and the Alternative Investment Fund Managers directive by the inclusion of sustainability risks into this pieces of legislation. At the beginning of the EU action plan journey, we also heard that 2 potential pieces of legislation would come out. That's the EU Green Bond Standard and the Eco-Label. We have some information that the EU Green Bond Standard will further develop or continue its development at the beginning of next year. And for the Eco-Label, it seems to be quite stopped. Some voices say that it has been abandoned, but there is nothing official yet. So we're still pending a bit more information there. And then as we see things from our daily work with clients and also in the industry, we see these 3 major upcoming challenges. So the entry into force of the SFDR RTS now in the 1st of January. And of course, all the templates that probably most of you have already filed with the specific regulators where you have your product domiciled. So that was a huge effort and will continue to be as the RTS evolves with the inclusion of gas and nuclear. Then another challenge is the template for the PAI statement at the entity level, which will need to be published in June, following also the template provided by the SFDR RTS, and the different data points that need to be covered there are still somewhat a challenge. And finally, we also see as a challenge the taxonomy disclosures, in particular the Article 8 disclosures, which are also linked to the NFRD and the CSRD. So everything is very much linked, and we are all still trying to make sense of it. Also, common threads that we can identify is the regulatory ambiguity. So regulations have been popping up like mushrooms in a very short period of time. So it's important to keep up with the regulatory developments and the guidance and Q&As from the regulators and from the ESAs to have a common understanding on what certain things mean. Also, data availability is, of course, always a challenge. In certain areas, the requirements are quite comprehensive, particularly around the requirements or the reporting requirements on the investor side. However, sometimes these reporting requirements, they don't match the investee companies. So, for example, if your fund is investing in a company in the US, they might not report certain information that is mandatory for companies in the EU. So there we have a bit of a challenge, and accessing this data can be difficult. And then another common thread that we have identified is the ambitious timelines. So for example, the RTS now includes gas and nuclear in the templates for articles, for products that are Article 8 or Article 9. But we still don't know whether this will be accepted or approved by the Parliament and the Council. So to align this disclosure with the deadlines can be a bit of a challenge. And this is why we see that a lot of funds, as Morningstar has pointed out in this image on the right-hand side of the slide, a lot of funds, due to these upcoming challenges and threats and the lack of common understanding, are being downgraded from Article 9 to Article 8. That's a huge movement all around. I mean, when it comes to the SFDR related products, and we hope that with further clarification on what the meaning of sustainable investment is, and other questions that were asked to the Commission, these funds will be then again reclassified to Article 9, and there won't be any more downgrades. But for that, of course, we need more clarification. And then what do we expect in 2023? This timeline looks already quite full, but as we saw for 2022, a lot of the developments that we had were not projected in the initial timeline for 2022. So probably this timeline will be filled with a bit more developments that will happen. So of course, Q3 will be marked by the SFDR RTS entering into force. We also expect the answers from the Commission to the questions that were sent to them. And also non-financial undertakings will start disclosing their taxonomy alignment. So that will also inform the reports or the periodic reports under the SFDR. Here we have included also some interesting Swiss deadlines for you to have in mind. So the SBA ESG guidelines in Q1 and also the YAMAS ESG guidelines in Q3. As of the developments in Q2, Q3, and Q4, they are also very much linked to the SFDR and the EU taxonomy. So the PAI statement that will need to be published in Q2 following the RTS, and also some developments from the ESAs when it comes to greenwashing or the fund names consultation. Also, as Lana mentioned, the reporting standards from the EFRAG will need to be approved or adopted by the Commission in June. And in Q3, Q4, we're expecting some amendments to be approved and some proposals when it comes to Solvency II, taxonomy, and ESG ratings. And with
Excellent, thank you,
yes.
Núria. With that, we are happy to take questions, and we already have our first question. I would just read it to you, Núria, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the inclusion of nuclear and gas in RTS for Article 8 and 9 funds. How can we do this and meet the January 1st deadline?
That's, of course, a big challenge. We still don't know if the Parliament and the Council will approve them. Most likely they will by the end of the year, but also the regulators, they are aware that most of the pre-contractual disclosures have already been filed with the regulators. So as we see it, this will be included in the next update of your pre-contractual documents and prospectuses. So regulators cannot expect to have this included and assess this as a wrong practice if this is approved one day before the actual deadline. So we expect this to be approved, but then of course this should be included in the next update that you do of your legal documents.
So quintessentially that there is a longer grace period for the inclusion.
Yes.
And maybe just to add on that, on the EMA side, we are also an active member of EFAMA, and through EFAMA there is also some lobbying kind of activities related to making trying to influence the fact that there won't be specific enforcement or active, let's say, enforcement of those two particular areas, nuclear and gas, when it comes to this, at least in the beginning. Not sure whether this would be heard, but that's at least the direction that EFAMA is also taking.
And I would think that there is an understanding that this will be a huge challenge now. So I would assume that there will be some amount of grace there. We also have another question, which is maybe a bit more philosophical in nature. Do you think there will be still a place for Article 6, or the goal is to marginalize that kind of product, which maybe is a different question also, whether there is a goal to marginalize those and whether there is still a place for those?
Well, I'm not able to comment on whether there is a goal to marginalize this kind of products, right? That's something for the EU Commission, so I'm not able to comment on that. But I do think that there is still place for Article 6 products. In fact, they amount for the majority of products in the EU fund spectrum. Yeah, I definitely think there is still place, and especially for small market players that might not have access to certain data that is needed for Article 8 and 9 products, or they don't want to position themselves now in this sustainability world. there is still, of course, place for Article 6 products.
Yes, so I would see this a little bit different, and that is that the goal would be to marginalize those products over time, because the EU has made quite strong commitments on climate, and now negotiating its biodiv commitments, which are all sort of embedded into this. So over time, we need to move towards Article 8 and 9, and this is a direction that the EU wants to take, right? And also moving the real economy in this direction. So over time, this will be the push, or needs to be the push, if the EU wants to maintain with its global commitments. Just to put this a little bit more into the larger context, I guess. But I do agree with Núria that at the moment we still see predominantly Article 6, and I think for, in particular, smaller companies, it is really, really difficult to keep up with all of these requirements for Article 8 and 9. So once we have a bit more practice in this, I guess there's also an opportunity there. Then there is another question, and that is, what are you expecting from the European Commission on the question of a definition of sustainable investments? Will we see specific thresholds set?
I would like to see some specific threshold set. In fact, some regulators, they have issued guidance that the funds domiciled in their jurisdictions need to meet with certain thresholds. So let's say 90%, 95, 80. So I would expect the Commission to adopt such a threshold based opinion on what a sustainable investment is. And that would also clarify a lot, and would help asset managers do their job and understand what a sustainable investment is, and stop with the ambiguity around this definition.
I mean, related to this is maybe also a little bit the ESMA's guidelines on fund names, right, Núria?
Correct, because there we already have guidelines and thresholds on what a specific fund needs to invest in, or what proportion of sustainable investments they need to have. And there we have 50%, 80%, and depending on the underlying investments of the product, it will be classified, or it will be able to have a certain name.
So this is on slide 14, Georgina, when we sent you the presentation, essentially, but it's currently just a proposal, right? And we'll see how this will be taken forward also by the Commission.
Great. Any other questions? If not, we will take the opportunity of the few minutes left to let Lana or Núria, I'm not sure who, present an initiative and platform proposed by ECOFACT, so a project. I'll let you know more, Lana and Núria, and also trying also maybe to gather some feedback from asset managers, whether it makes sense also to them, this proposal and this initiative that you are leading on your side.
Thank you, Núria. I will give the word to you then.
Sure. Yeah, so we receive a lot of questions in our advisory projects regarding how certain provisions of the EU action plan, so regarding SFDR or EU Taxonomy or MIFID, and the more that will come. So we receive a lot of questions on how certain provisions are applied by their peers. And of course, we cannot share information from one client to another. So we came up with the idea to create some sort of platform where we would act as a third neutral party and gather the information that you are working on, and from there create some detailed analysis, very structured, on the practices that we see that are more common among your peers, the most divergent practice, what we see as the best practice, etc., etc. So to have a common understanding of what certain regulations and what certain provisions mean. We would then also have monthly calls to present the analysis that we have performed, and then of course this would be absolutely confidential. So as I said, we would act as a neutral third party, gathering the information and creating the analysis to create these best practice that we don't have at the moment due to the lack of guidance from the regulators and from the ESAs.
Thank you, Núria. With that, I think we can conclude here. Thank you to Aurelia. Happy Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone. And if you have any questions, our email addresses are on the first slide, or also feel free to reach out to us via Aurelia. And we're happy to answer your questions also on the MPPAM here. And again, I all wish you very nice holidays.
And just to conclude, just to add that the presentation and the recording will be available on the member-only side of our website, so you would be able to access it there in case you want to review any of the different webinars, also the one from MIFID 2 if you want to deep dive in some of those, and the previous one. Thank you again to Núria and to Lana for the great presentation, and Merry Christmas from all of us also at AMAS and the rest for holidays. We look forward to see you in 2023. Thank you and have a good day.